Hello. First and foremost, I'm encouraged and overwhelmed by how many people are in this room right now. So thanks very much for turning up. My name is Jamie Smith. I've worked for Sumo Digital. I've been at Sumo for about 4 years now. I'm a principal game designer, and this talk, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a design sensibilities for a collaborative culture. So hopefully this is pretty useful. Quick background about me, because this background ties directly into the talk itself. I've been in games for about 12 years now, to this very week, actually. Scoop was there on the first day, sat in the middle. And I've basically worked on 9 titles, many more than that. You know, some may not necessarily seen the light of day, some smaller titles with less smaller contribution. And that's across 3 studios. So some of the most recent games I've been working on, that's Sumo, this is Hood, and Call of Duty. Before that, I was at EA working on the FIFA franchise remotely. And then before that, I was on the Driver franchise, The Crew, and The Division at Ubisoft. So it's mostly kind of AAA focused. And I should say that's the one caveat about this talk as well, is hopefully it's useful for as many people as possible, but it does have a AAA kind of focus. So just when I said it ties into the talk itself, I've been on a lot of different teams. I've been on a lot of different projects, established franchises, new IP, different genres, large teams, small teams, successful teams, not so successful teams, broad scope, niche prototypes, regional and international teams. So especially on Call of Duty, that's a game that gets made over 24 hours a day all over the world. Across language barriers and time zones. So this is both with France and kind of Sweden. And also this is across development, publishing, and academia. So I should say that whilst I've not been in the industry forever, I've seen a lot kind of in the time, and hopefully there's some takeaways I just wanted to bring up with this. And the main takeaway, and this is kind of the feed line for the whole talk, is that every project I've worked on, every team I've ever been involved in, is that change is the only constant. You can always assume that no matter what project you're going to be on, what team you're going to be on, that change is always going to be different every single time. So that got me thinking about this one question. And this is, again, the feed line of the whole talk, which is, what universal approaches can be taken to foster a collaborative culture between mixed discipline peers, irrespective of team size, location, or project scope? So this is, whilst it is from a design perspective, I'm game designer myself, I'm hoping that this is applicable to as many people as possible. So quick overview of the talk before we get into the meat of it. Generally speaking, I think good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. So a lot of the stuff that's in this talk are mistakes, not just from myself, but other people that I've seen in kind of meetings. And also it's mostly kind of first-hand experience as well. So if it's not from myself, it's from things that I've personally witnessed. It can be described as pragmatic common sense. In half an hour's time, if you come away thinking he's just talked about a whole bunch of stuff that I already knew, I think the talk or the takeaway is more that I just don't think a lot of people practice this stuff as much as they might preach it. So hopefully that's useful. The talk itself is split into 3 parts. So the leader, the team, and the project. A quick litmus test. How many of you in the room are not designers? Just with a quick show of hands. That's about half-ish. So as I said, this is from a designer's perspective, but I'm hoping that with it being split into 3 sections, it's applicable for as many people as possible. And then the last one is that it's all about timely anecdotes and analogies. So some of it is about project experience, some of it's about certain things that I can, I've encountered in different things. And the mention about the timely kind of part, some of the things I'm about to mention are more applicable at different stages of development than others. So I'll put a little diagram in each of the pictures that demonstrate that. So for the meat of the talk, just take a quick swig. So for the leader, in the broadest possible sense, this is the linchpin or the focal point of the team. It's not always designer. On teams I've been involved in, it's always been the feature owner, or what we would call a feature owner, who's responsible for bringing something to kind of fruition as part of the mixed discipline team. So this is speaking directly to the leader. So first and foremost, it's all about setting the course. Much like in the image in the background, hopefully you're not driving into a volcano, but at the same time, this is about driving towards a direction. You can't necessarily say exactly what's going there, but you're going in a certain direction. And that comes from intent, wherever the feature goals might be. It might come from design direction or wherever else. The reason I mention this first is because everything from this point going onwards, you don't get a lot of value out of this talk if you don't start with goals in your particular team. I've been on teams where the goals are so strict that the team doesn't get a lot of autonomy. And I've also had the complete opposite of that, where they've got so much freedom that everybody's going in completely different directions. So it always starts with intent and goals. defined by whoever might be the focal point of the team. The next one, 3 is the magic number. I should mention, related to this, one of the jokes I kind of have is, how long does it take for people to work in the games industry to work out that the answer is always 3 for everything, in terms of how many perks, trees you're going to have, how many features you're going to work on at a given time, what the top priorities. 3 is always the magic number, and you'll see 3 a lot throughout this talk. I did skip over it, but if you look at the little diagram that's in the bottom kind of right, the little circle, that basically represents 1 is the start of the project. Most people might call it kind of like the ideation phase or pre-production. 3 is the end of the project, where you're coming in hot into release. 2 is where I call this the messy middle, where everybody calls it production, but that's that. So each of these points refer to different stages of development. And the reason I mentioned 3, if you've got a big list of feedback that people are bringing towards you, if you want people to concentrate on certain things, always just cut it down to 3, because as people might know about the cognitive load, that most people can remember between 3 or 7 things at any given time, barring your phone number. 3 is at the lower end of that. So yeah, 3 is easy to remember for people. The next one, marginal innovation. So this is a big one for me. This is actually one of the reasons why I'm in games in the first place, is just that when you come and work on a new feature, and for us, I'll try to provide context to some of these slides as I go through. We were working on a Robin Hood game. Some of you might have played it, especially if you got it on Epic Games Store or PS Plus kind of recently. And the idea was that we're bringing a Robin Hood game to life. It's got a bow and arrow. There's certain expectations that people have with bow and arrow mechanics, from The Last of Us, Tomb Raider, and so on. And what we want to do is take the baseline of what they've kind of laid out, make it approachable for people, make it easy for people to get into the experience, but then also, where we can, kind of level up that experience a little bit as well. So we got the benefit of being on PS5. So if anybody's used the new DualSense controller, we use that to a certain degree to make it feel really satisfying to hit people. The satisfaction of when you land the headshot against somebody. Again, I don't know how many people's played the game, but if you do get the opportunity, shoot somebody in the head, and it feels super satisfying every single time, especially from the other side of the map. And the other one, just want to mention about this, is we have a really nice behavior in the game where we actually make it more generous to shoot targets from a distance than we do really close up. So we're trying to live into that fantasy of, you're getting the wonder shot from halfway over the map. And these are 3 things that, the games hadn't really done up until this point. The reason I mention this in terms of collaboration is because everything I've just mentioned is pretty feasible. Whereas if you want to start from, we want to throw everything away that, Last of Us and Tomb Raider and those have done, that's a much more difficult challenge to start from kind of ground zero. So yeah, there's no shame in kind of leveling up on top of others. So the next one, form follows function. This is something a lot of the designers I kind of know work to. And this is just the idea of defining what the purpose is of wherever it is that you're designing or wherever you're creating, and how that feeds into the work that you're going to produce. So the image that's on screen, this is from Call of Duty Vanguard. And this is one of the missions where you play as it's quite dark on that screen actually, but you play as a grenade specialist. So it's like the explosive specialist. And the things with this is that basically they want to introduce some new behaviors that were only applicable to lethal grenades. So this is the idea that it's specifically for lethal grenades, that you have some kind of UI that has a minimalist aesthetic, that it suggests the throw trajectory. So again, you're the explosive specialist. You're trying to make it so that you can show people that you are the explosive specialist. It signifies the impact and also the ending locations as well. And if anybody's played the multiplayer on this, you'll see that you can use that arc that's on screen, kind of in the middle of the screen. You can use that to bounce off walls. This was also used as a tutorial. So this is the first time in the game that you come across this mechanic. And the idea is you've got to throw it into the tank. Now, out of everything I've just mentioned, which is the function, the form of that was, it was just some work for the UI team. So we didn't necessarily have to introduce new animations. We didn't necessarily have to have 15 different barks for every time you throw the grenade. The idea is basically not necessarily trying to create more work for people than you need to, because work is time, time is money. And unfortunately, on any project, you'll run out of both at some point. So it's not necessarily about adding too much work for people, which also, people get a surprise. They come in Monday morning, they've got 10 giras of stuff that they've got to do. So it's basically just about trying to do, not necessarily the minimum, but define the function first before the form. Elegance and simplicity. So this is kind of similar to the previous one, except that you've probably been in this situation before, where you've got multiple problems with a certain feature, or you've got multiple problems in your game, and you're trying to find that silver bullet that kind of kills them all dead in one go, if you can. In this example, that's Robin Hood. He's kind of up in his vantage point. Towards the left-hand side, the blue kind of explosion, that's his explosive arrow. In the final game, that's exactly what we had. That was an explosive arrow. It's a special ability. It was ideally used to empower the cover star, because before this point, we didn't use that weapon whatsoever. We had a sheriff that was in the game, so Mr. X has been mentioned a few times kind of recently in these talks. So Mr. X, and this is our kind of version of the sheriff, he wanders around the map. He's the objective kind of carrier, and he's impossible to take down, much like Mr. X in Resident Evil. We also have another character called John, who goes into a berserker mode that you can't kill him. You can't kill either of those two characters. And also with Robin, up until this point, there was no way to kill multiple people at once. One arrow would kill one person. We introduced the explosive arrow, pretty much all of them problems disappeared in one fell swoop. You could take down the sheriff, you could take down John when he's in his special ability, you could kill multiple people. I should say that in my 12 years in games, I've probably had less than half a dozen times where this has happened, where you've been able to come up with one solution to kill as many problems as possible. But in general, if you come across that, it's a pretty nice feeling, because you save everybody time and a lot of effort. But yeah, just to keep that in mind, sometimes the most simple and most obvious option is the best. In this case, an explosive arrow is not the most original idea. There's other games that have already done that stuff, but it worked for us to solve a bunch of problems. Minimum change, maximum impact. And this is all about the idea of the butterfly effect. Generally speaking, especially for most designers in the room, you probably know about the kind of adage, you make a change, and then you test it. You make another change, and then you test it. So you definitely need to know what's been changed and why. That's fine. And then the next stage after that is, I like to think of it as, what's the minimum or what's the single change that you could make that has the largest possible beneficial experience, beneficial impact upon the experience itself. So what's the minimum thing that you can do could benefit the game the most? On top of that, ideally, if you can, try to do it without creating work for people. So the example that's on the screen here, so this is again Call of Duty Vanguard. One of the things that they wanted to do in the campaign was to make it you feel considerate about every single shot that you fire. So have much more meaning to the bullets and everything that you do. Up until this point, the previous Call of Duty games are more like Rambo. You can shoot as many bullets as you want. So this was about making it impactful. If somebody says to you, what's the one thing that you would change in the game to make that type of experience come to life? Generally speaking, you'd probably come to the conclusion it's to change the ammo count in the game. They get the benefit in Call of Duty, obviously. They've got all the animations and the weapons from the previous games. But the quick way to test this thing is basically to reduce the ammo count in the game to the point of where the players really kind of considerate of their shots. If anybody has played the campaign, you'll see that, and everything just works kind of out the box. That's the fortunate thing on that side. But yeah, just to keep that in mind is, ideally, change one thing, and if you can, change the thing that has the most drastic or beneficial impact upon the game itself, as opposed to changing like 5, 10, 15 different things and see which one kind of works. And then the last one, this is for this section, is that many heads are better than one. So this is the idea of just we before me. I've probably come to a conclusion, for a lot of games, a lot of teams I've been involved in, teams that work better together is always better than having one single superstar. If anybody's a Man United fan at the moment, you'll see that problem all over again. But it's just to bear in mind, unlike Hitman, you are not there to do the job on your own. You're there to do it as part of a group of people. And always, the collective contribution of everybody is going to oversell, the single benefit that you can bring as an individual. And I'll cover this a bit more in the next section. So, quick, brief overview of that one. Provide 3 clear goals to innovate underappreciated features. I put the underappreciated part, but I have a particular kind of fetish for overlooked, underappreciated features that people just kind of dismiss. They're my favorite kind of features to kind of look at in terms of design. Focus on minimalism, but keep an eye on the creative ingredients at all times. So, what you bring to the party. And in general, being a great teammate is better than being a great insert your discipline kind of here. In this case, it's design focused, but this could be any discipline. Okay, so for the team. So we talk about the leader. This is about everybody, including the leader, which generally speaking, teams I've been in is a mixed discipline team. So this is animation, production, and so on. This is everybody. So first and foremost, embrace the unfamiliar. There's a lot of projects I've been on previously. Before I'd worked in an open world game, I'd never worked on an open world game. Before I'd worked on a PlayStation kind of platform, I'd never worked on a PlayStation platform, and so on. There's lots more games, there's lots more opportunities these days where if you're sticking with a single genre, a single team, a single format, a single whatever it may be, you can get people that will resist that kind of change within your team. And it's just anybody, who's in that kind of situation, just please try keep it kind of, an open book to wherever might come your way. And this might mean it's a change of tech, it might be a change of engine, it might be, new people in the team, it might be, anything pretty much. It might be the difference between new IP and a sequel, for example. That adds a lot of apprehension for people. And the next one, this is the second time this has been mentioned today actually as well, is listen first, talk last. I should say that this whole talk assumes that this is with face-to-face kind of people, kind of chatting to each other, and or video calls. So ideally, I'm not personally a big fan of kind of text, but when it comes to meeting etiquette, listen first, talk last. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is somebody in the room might have a really good idea and you might kind of shoot them down because you're the oracle of knowledge, or you're the person that's worked on, open world games for the past 10 years, therefore they're going to listen to you. There'll be people who will be scared to speak up because they might be inexperienced, they might have the quietest voice in kind of the room. But one thing I quite like to do is try get everybody's opinion, try bring them into the conversation if you notice they're kind of being quiet, and generally speaking, be almost like the last person to kind of summarize things at the end, because at least that way you get to take in everybody's kind of thoughts. Ideally, you just don't want somebody dominating the conversation, that's all. Yes, and. So you might have heard variations on this before, and especially if you're at the bar tonight, you might like this one, which is write drunk, edit sober. So this is the idea of basically when somebody comes up with some ideas, basically try not to shoot them down straight away. I can't tell you how many times I haven't got enough fingers to count over the years where you go into a meeting and the first thing somebody says is that's not going to work because we tried that 3 weeks ago and it didn't work. We tried that in the previous project and we didn't have the manpower and so on for it. Generally speaking, I would just suggest here is just to do things in 2 rounds, a bit like what I've just mentioned. The first one is kind of anything goes. Anything goes within reason because you should have some kind of goals and intent by this point, for example, so you're at least steering in some kind of direction. And then I would do a second round, which is more about feasibility kind of test. People might have some great opinions or some great ideas, but the reality is that it might take 2 years to implement them, or it might take 2 days. So it just depends. So again, I would just always suggest doing it in 2 rounds and try if you can. I wouldn't necessarily say remove the negative people from the room, but I would try and coach people into being, more open to ideas, just generally speaking. So this one's twofold. So the first part is about agreeing on the ambition. So imagine that you're about to try and scale that mountain that's in the distance, if you can see that. And this is all about being rigid with your destination. So that's where we're going to. Be absolutely rigid with your destination because it gets everybody on board with where you're going. But the second part of this is that be willing to disagree on the details. So it doesn't matter how you kind of get there, so long as you know that you're going to the foot of the mountain. Are you going to barrel through the trees? Are you going to go to the right? Are you going to realize that you weren't supposed to go up to the mountain on the right? You're supposed to go to the one on the left. It's all an analogy, but just the idea is, and again, I've been in some meetings where maybe direction says, say in the Call of Duty example, we're going to remove ammo from the game because it's going to be much more considerate for the player to be considerate of their shots. I've seen some people instantly shoot that down and say, that's not Call of Duty, so we don't want to do that. That person now becomes a blocker for pretty much every single decision that somebody's going to say afterwards, because the chances are is that they're going to keep disagreeing on all the smaller stuff. The way I would suggest you go about this, and this is especially mixed discipline teams to add some credit, is disagree on the small things. And once you basically start building up some credit with people about adding some nice ideas to the table, then you can add more weight into the bigger kind of decisions. So yeah, that's just a little tip, a suggestion for that. The 30-90 feedback. So I'll give you a quick story before I go through this one. Again, for those of you that haven't played Hood, it's predominantly a stealth game, which is not what's happening here. A couple of people getting beaten up. But this image that's on screen, that's in the final version of the game, exactly what you see here. So this is an Unreal Engine. You've got our character in the center of the screen. It's our version of Friar Tuck, basically. And he's got what I would call a cannonball on a bungee cord, and he's hitting people out the way. Now, that image is not how the game originally looked. The first version, again, for anybody who's doing prototypes, what we had was default Unreal kind of mannequins, dodgy kind of animations, terrible networking because it's a network kind of game as well, and everything else that they can possibly imagine. The feedback that we got from that very first version, it was about the time when the new God of War just came out, and almost every single person compared it immediately to a fully completed AAA game with several hundred people and kind of Sony money, compared our prototype to that, the first version, which is unreasonable at best. The thing to just keep in mind with that is a lot of the feedback that we got at that early stage, in the nicest possible way, was not useful whatsoever, because people were commenting on a feature that was in its first bare bones kind of variation, and that you're comparing it to wherever was the last game that they played, which at the time was God of War. So this is where the 30-90 feedback kind of comes in. So 30-90 represents 30% or 90%. Is it a first pass, which is the 30%, or is it the final push, which is 90%? On Call of Duty, we used to call this something slightly different, which is it the meat and potatoes, or is it the gravy? Nobody just wants a pot of gravy, but also the meat and potatoes is flavorless if you don't have it. So the idea is it's about establishing a nice foundation for your features. In this case, this is combat. So we don't care, for example, in the 30%, we don't care about the sparks, how the feedback of what it looks like. We don't care about the trails that's going around the environment. We just care that you can actually hit a target consistently. We just care that what you see on what's on one person's screen is the same as what's on the other person's screen in network replications. It's about the foundations kind of first. Whereas some people were saying, things like the weapon should do this and, should remove some frames from the animation and so on. So just keep that in mind, because the 90%, especially for the artists in the room, the 90% is when you scrutinize every single pixel on the entire screen. And that's the time to really kind of hammer it home, because that'll take you kind of further. But yeah, again, it's a general rule. It works twofold as well. So this is for the designer or the team to let the team know, what's the feedback that you actually want. And also it's for the other people to tell the designer or the team, feedback in that kind of area. But yeah, keep that in mind. It might be handy for some people. And I touched upon this earlier, the we before me kind of thing. The way I look at game development, again, a little bit of a dark image, but is everything is greater than the sum of their parts. So if this is your team, all working together to, do something, wherever it be, maybe building a feature, laying out new land in the games development industry, the idea is that a designer can't do it on their own. An artist can't do it on their own. An animator can't do it on their own. Everybody working together is always going to achieve something much greater than the sum of their parts. You might get some people can do things together. It'll take you only so far, but generally speaking, everybody's contribution is always going to take it further than the collective kind of few. So, quick summary on that section. First and foremost, be pragmatic, embrace challenge and ambition. Just generally speaking, this is for everybody in the team. Be a good listener. Again, that was mentioned, I think, of the Ubisoft talk this morning, and elevate the ideas of others. And the last one, crowdsource contributions, but temper the feedback that you get from that. I'm actually making good time in this. So for the project, so you have the leader, you have a team that's working on a particular feature, maybe it's combat, stealth, wherever it may be. The project is multiple teams kind of working together to pull something together in the greater whole. So this is in the broadest possible sense, everybody, pretty much. First one, strong pillars, no filler. I remember we were working on HUD, much like the images that you've been seeing on screen. It's very dark. It's dark medieval kind of style. It's very visceral. We chatted about Game of Thrones a lot when we were working on it, so it's that kind of vibe. Anytime that you work in a medieval game, Monty Python's going to come into the conversation. And I remember pretty early on, somebody said, let's have Holy Grail references all over the game, or maybe some achievements, maybe there's a certain character and things like that. And that's great. Again, I'm not one to kind of throw ideas away. But the problem was that idea stayed in the game or stayed around for so long that actually it wasn't really contributing to the core pillar of the game, which is about a visceral kind of, hardcore kind of experience. And the other side of that is, and I say this a lot, is that possession's 9/10 of the law. So something that's in the game, people are going to become attached to it. And when you take it out, you're going to get resistance from people taking that out. And ultimately, a character that's from Monty Python Holy Grail should have never been there in the first place, pretty much. So again, strong pillars, no filler. So if there's anything that's not quite matching the experience, don't be afraid to take it out early. Leverage inspiration. So I said earlier, I briefly mentioned it. So basically, this is our variation, and Mr. X is basically called the Sheriff. So the Sheriff of Nottingham, if you're familiar with Robin Hood kind of law. And the idea is that basically this is a variation on something that already existed in games, which means it made it extremely easy for people in the team to feed behind an idea because there was something that was already in existence. So I'll give you a few examples. So first and foremost, he stood head and shoulders above every single character in the game. So all of our characters in Hood are all the same height, except for the Sheriff. He's much, much taller. The next one is we intended him to have a slow walk like Darth Vader. Spoiler alert, if anyone's seen Obi-Wan, Darth Vader walks. That's all he does. He doesn't ever run. He doesn't ever fly. He always walks, which makes him much more imposing. The booming footsteps, we used to chat about it like Jurassic Park, when you get the kind of the water shake. So we started to use evocative language about how we wanted this character to feel. A terrifying voice like the mountain in Game of Thrones. We got to another point where somebody said, what's the weapon that the Sheriff should have? Should he have a giant cleaver? Should he have like a double swords or something? And we just said, why doesn't he even need a weapon? The mountain can just pop things with people's heads, with his hands. So this was all a way to get people behind the idea because it was something that they were familiar with. And what ended up, especially when the game released, a lot of people said it's a Mr. X kind of like character because we'd always intended it to be that way. And with the booming footsteps on the PS5 as well, the Sheriff is the objective carrier, and the idea is to find out where his location is. We used the haptics in a 360 on the pad to kind of imply kind of roughly where he was, and that was the Jurassic Park kind of thing, when the booming footsteps. Next one, value first. So I quite like the image of Hitman for this, and the reason is because Hitman just goes for one or a few kind of high value targets. I'm a big fan of value first at all times, and what I mean by that is no matter how many things that you need to work on, you should always work on the thing that's providing the most value. It doesn't matter if that means it takes 6 hours or 6 weeks. You should work on the thing that provides the most value to the game. I've been on some teams where people work on things that it's kind of easier or quicker to add something. And certainly in the final third of the project, I think that diagram's maybe a little bit wrong. In the final third, you'll start hearing things like bang for buck. Should we get these 5 features in versus this one kind of feature? But certainly in the early stages, everybody in your team should be working on the thing that contributes to the core experience as much as possible and not kind of doing side work or something that's easy just because they can. Next one, define the problem. So this is an interesting one. So this is our John character. So again, if you know Little John from kind of Robin Hood, he's holding up the gate and basically he's our big kind of heavy character. You'll see the big hammer that's on his back. Originally, that wasn't a hammer. It was a giant javelin, like a big spear that you could throw. What was really cool about it is that you could throw it, you could impale people, you could kill them in one shot. It was really, really powerful. Everybody loved it kind of unanimously. It was really, really cool. Until one day, we removed it from the game. And as you can imagine, like hate mail came my way for lots of people in the team. And the reason why we mentioned that is because we had 4 characters in our game, and we wanted to split them in 2 different directions. So one was more of a melee-focused direction, the other one was a ranged focus. And this John character, which is supposed to be our melee character, was almost like this weird kind of blend that was in between. The feedback that we got was the spear, the javelin is absolutely awesome. It feels really good. I want to kill people like no problem. I want to one-shot people. We removed it from the game. Loads and loads of hate mail. 2 weeks later, we gave John the ability to go into a hardcore kind of rage mode. Nobody mentioned to this day the spear or the javelin ever again. The reason is because the feedback wasn't that they loved the javelin. The feedback is that they wanted to feel empowered. So what people say and what people mean are 2 different things. And when we removed the spear, he was no longer empowered. When we introduced this berserker kind of mode, he was empowered again. Nobody mentioned the spear ever again. So just keep that in mind that whenever you get feedback, it's not necessarily to act upon it, but sometimes there's a hidden message that people are kind of telling you. So just keep that in mind. Because again, that feeds into more work. Subtractive method. So a lot of us call this subtractive design, but effectively this is for everybody. So less is more. So this environment that you see on screen, this is from Call of Duty. This is from Vanguard. This is a mission called Bougainville. And the idea is that you're a crashed kind of plane pilot, you're dumped in the jungle, and you've got to survive. Now, every single thing that you see on screen, pretty much, was already in Call of Duty to some degree. The trees, the fog, so they know exactly how much it's going to impact upon the frame rates, the density of stuff. There's a waypoint system in the game that tells you kind of where to go if you get lost. They repurposed that waypoint system to find your kind of teammates, hidden in the jungle kind of somewhere. They promoted people to do stealth and crouched kind of kills. Every single thing I've just mentioned was already in the game, and yet they created a unique kind of one-off experience using the things that they already had, rather than keep adding ideas to the game all the time. So sometimes it's about taking the Lego bricks and building them in a different order. It's worth keeping that in mind because, as I said, especially in this mission, the other thing I didn't mention is that this mission was made in a matter of months, pretty much, and yet it's still a pretty high-profile mission and quite memorable in the game as well. So it's not always about adding things to the game. Love the player. So again, I've only got a couple more slides. So love the player, especially in this day and age, loving the player's more prominent than ever. You can pay 60 quid for a game on Game Pass now, and you'll get, especially if you have Ultimate, you have access to 500 games. People are playing games for less than an hour and a half every day. People do not want a bad experience within that first 10 minutes. And I've seen that in a lot of kind of games. The reason I put this image on here is we have stealth in Hood. And stealth was subject to lots of issues, which was lighting kind of issues in the game. Sometimes we would get a build and the next day you wouldn't be able to play the game stealthily kind of anymore. So that kind of play style's out the window. Sometimes the AI wouldn't behave exactly the way that you would want them to. The next day you can't play the game the way that you want it to. You give people a bad experience from the off. So just be mindful of wherever features you're working on, bear in mind the knock-on effect of, say, what happens when the nav mesh gets rebuilt and then all of a sudden the core feature of your game stops working because people are going to have a bad experience kind of from the off. Just keep that in mind. And then the last one for this section is just to celebrate successes. I should say that, I wouldn't necessarily say that this doesn't happen enough, but I'm a big fan of giving credit where it's due. The mission that's on screen, this is from Midway on Call of Duty. It's a naval battle from kind of the 40s. And the idea is basically you got to fly down, avoid some kind of gunfire for some ships, kill the ships, and then kind of fly away. And that's pretty much the mission. During development, this was considered like one of the weakest kind of missions in terms of playtesting. And the idea is that they wanted to kind of turn it around. And from this, they opened it up to the team, which was the team that I was part of, and said, how would you improve this mission? Kind of where would it go? What would you do? What would you change? So this was over a year ago, before Top Gun. I said the suggestion I would make is that I want to make this mission Maverick in a rust bucket. So the idea being you're an ace pilot, but you can get shot down really easily. On top of that, to revamp the pacing of the entire mission, because again, what you see in the final game is not what was there kind of originally. The team itself, so this was not me, this was the team, put that feedback into kind of action, and then all the directors loved it, playtesters kind of loved it, and everybody that was part of that kind of process was celebrated in terms of big meetings and stuff and called out by name. So it wasn't kind of somebody else taking the, taking the praise from everybody else. Everybody was highlighted as this person did this person's idea, this was, the new direction. And also it went from being the second lowest rated mission in the game to the second highest rated mission. And also it was really memorable because it's the only mission where you're not on foot pretty much. So a lot of people remembered it. But again, a little credit goes a long way, because that team as well used to work on Dead Space, a lot of the people. And I love Resident Evil and I love Dead Space. So it meant a lot coming from those people as well. So praise people when they deserve it. So summary for the project. Blend strong pillars with soft inspirations. The soft inspirations, take from what's kind of out there, and strong pillars, don't go against those. Interrogate feedback, put value first, and subtract content. And love the player, love the team, pretty much. Takeaways. So I asked the question at the start, fostering a collaborative culture between mixed discipline peers, irrespective of team size, location, or project scope. I've made, and these are suggestions, by the way, 21 suggestions, which are for the leaders, for the team, and for the projects. I'll leave that up just in case anyone needs a picture of it. These are all kind of shorthands for everything that I've just chatted about, but I'm sure that a lot of people have probably had very similar kind of scenarios to this in their development. And just with the next slide, just a couple of more recommendations. terms of further reading, in the interest of sticking with 3, most people have heard of Creativity Inc., bottom corner. You might have read it, you might not have, but I can recommend that. Leaders Eat Last, kind of bottom middle. That will lead you to most of the other stuff that's on this page anyway. And then top middle, Communicating Across Disciplines. It's a couple of GDC talks along the same kind of note. Cool, I can recommend all those. And just a final one before I take any questions. You'll see a bunch of names. There'll be quite small text, unfortunately, scrolling up the screen. This is everybody who helped contribute towards this talk, either directly or indirectly. And that's the last thing I got to mention, is just kind of practice what you preach as well, because there's a lot of individuals in here. I'm just the face of this talk. But that's everything for me. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. I hope that was useful. I think there is a floating mic somewhere. No questions. Is it early finish to the bar then? Cool, I'll take that as a yes. All right, thanks very much for your time. Have a good develop. Thank you.